About a year ago I was at a military fair and one of the stall holders had several boxes full of cameras. Well, it would have been rude not to take a look, and I was immediately attracted to this Mamiya Sekor 500 DTL. There were actually quite a few cameras that I liked, but I was trying to be good, so I just bought the one. I knew it was going to need some work because the mirror wasn't returning every time after you fired the shutter, and the slow speed timer was sticking. I'll talk more about the repairs later in the video. The Mamiya Sekor TL and DTL cameras were introduced in the mid to late 60s, the earlier TL models only having spot metering, while the DTL models had switchable spot or average metering. The metering system used stop-down metering, whereby you pressed the film advancing lever towards the camera body to shut the aperture down to the preset value and turn the exposure meter on. This system is much simpler to engineer into a camera and its lenses than open aperture metering, and it works perfectly well as far as I'm concerned. There were three models of DTL. The 500 that I've got, which has a maximum shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. The 1000 DTL, which has a maximum shutter speed of 1,000th of a second. And the 2000 DTL. I'm sure you can guess the maximum shutter speed on that one. When I was originally shooting film, I was aware of Mamiya, but only for their medium format cameras like the 645, which was completely out of my league at that time. It wasn't until I got interested in film cameras again, after shooting digital for many years, that I found out about the 35mm cameras like the DTL. It's not a pretty camera by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's a bit of a brick, but it's really nice to use, and it feels like it could take a knock or two without even flinching. The 50mm f2 lens that came on my camera is really sharp, with good contrast compared to some of my other lenses from that period. I already had another Mamiya lens in my collection, a 55mm f1.8, which is also pretty good. This one, however, is radioactive, whereas the 50mm f2 on the 500 DTL isn't. I'm not sure at what point Mamiya started, or stopped, using thoriated glass in some of their lenses, but if radioactive lenses is something that concerns you, then it's worth bearing in mind that some Mamiya lenses will set the Geiger counter clicking. On the front of the camera is the self-timer lever, which I'm not going to use, as this turned out to be the issue that was making the mirror stick up. The timer module is working fine now I've cleaned and re-lubricated it, but its interface with the shutter release is temperamental. If I adjust it so it has enough throw to fire the shutter reliably every time, it doesn't always retract enough, which causes issues. And if I back off the adjustment so it does retract enough, it doesn't always fire the shutter fully, and the mirror can end up out of sequence, staying up after you fire the shutter. I can't remember exactly the behaviour because it was a year ago when I was working on it, but after much tinkering I decided just to leave it as it was and not use the self-timer. The camera takes standard M42 screw mount lenses, so there should be a plentiful supply of relatively cheap lenses out there for you to try out. On the left hand side of the lens mount are the flash sync sockets, X for electronic flash and FP for the old flash bulbs. And below that is the switch to select between spot metering and average metering. This also moves an indicator in the viewfinder so you know which mode you're in without taking your eye off your subject. On the top is the film rewind crank. This doesn't double up as the back door release on this camera, that's down the side. There's no hot or cold shoe, but I believe there was one available that clipped over the viewfinder eyepiece. Next to that is the combined film speed and shutter speed dial. Lift the knob and rotate to select film speeds between 25 ISO and 3200 ISO. It also shows you the DIN, or Deutsche Institut für Normung number, in the window opposite, and apologies for the pronunciation there. Once you've set your film speed, rotate the knob without lifting it to select the shutter speeds between 1/500th of a second and 1 second, plus the usual bulb. Obviously the 1000 DTL would also have 1,000ths of a second. As was the case on many cameras from this period, the internal meter can't read below a certain light level. Often the camera will have a physical stop to prevent you from using the speeds that are out of metering range, but on the Mamiya I can still go right down to 1 second and bulb, even though the film speed is set to 3200 ISO. In reality, the slowest speed you can accurately meter to is something like 1/4 or 1/8 of a second at that film speed. Behind the shutter speed dial is the film plane index mark, and to the right is the shutter release button. This has a really great feel to it. Enough tension so you don't accidentally trigger the shutter when you rest your finger on it, and a fairly short travel. Some of the old cameras that used a trap needle method of auto exposure have a massive travel on the shutter button, and I've missed a few epic shots using such cameras. You would of course get used to that if it was your main camera, whereas I tend to swap cameras all of the time. Next to that is the frame counter, which resets when you open the door, as you'd expect. And finally the film advance lever. When you advance the film, the lever stops slightly away from the camera body. From this position, push the lever towards the camera body to stop down the lens and activate the exposure meter. The lever then springs back when you let go, so the meter isn't left running all the time, draining the battery. If you want to return the lever to its rest position, just press the button in the centre of the advance lever, and in it goes. The trim on top of the film advance lever has been mauled at some point. It's only a disc of anodised aluminium. I did plan to make a replacement, but I haven't got round to that yet, and it complements the dent in the corner of the prism housing anyway. The release for the film door is on the left hand side of the camera. Just lift up the catch and the door pops open. On the bottom we have the tripod mount in the centre, the film rewind button on the right, and the battery hatch just to the left of the tripod socket. This takes a single SR44 battery, positive side facing you as you insert it. You can also use an LR44, but theoretically the discharge curve isn't quite as good as the silver oxide SR44. The viewfinder has a microprism centre spot to aid in focusing, which works really well. I usually prefer a split image system, but they seem to have got this one just about right. At the bottom is the spot and average metering indicator. The rectangle around the letter S more or less indicates the area for the spot metering. In fact, you should be able to see the brownish looking patch in that area. This is where the mirror is perforated, allowing light to reach the cell on the back of the mirror. The meter needle is on the right hand side. Adjust the shutter speed or aperture until the needle is in the middle of the backwards C, and your exposure should be about right. If it's pointing towards the plus side, your image will be overexposed, and if it's on the minus side, it will be underexposed. Loading a film is very much as you'd expect, and I've covered that on many other cameras, so I'll skip over that this time round. I'll talk more about the repairs I had to do in a bit, but first a quick break, and then a look at some of the shots taken on the 500 DTL. When I first got the camera, it kind of worked, but it was definitely in need of some maintenance. The mirror getting out of sequence was probably the main issue that prevented the camera from being used. As I mentioned earlier, that turned out to be an issue triggered by using the self-timer. I didn't manage to solve that one, so I just opted not to use the self-timer. The light seals, including many located inside the camera, were all perished, along with the mirror bumper foam. But probably the second biggest issue was the slow shutter timer, which was sticking. On some cameras this is easy to get at and clean and service, but that's not the case on the 500 DTL, where it's buried beneath the mirror box, so the whole camera needed to be dismantled, including two chains, one to link the ISO and shutter speed dial to the meter. It actually rotates the meter itself as you adjust the shutter speed knob. The second chain links the spot and average metering switch to the indicator in the viewfinder. Unlike many cameras, the mirror box is extracted upwards rather than forwards out of the camera chassis. Once that was out, cleaning and relubricating the slow timer was pretty simple, and it did give me a chance to clean and relubricate the rest of the camera at the same time. Once I'd finished the repairs, I popped a roll of FP4 in the camera and headed out to take some shots, a few of which you've already seen, and here are a few more. On paper, the 500 DTL, along with its other siblings, isn't that exciting. It's big and heavy, and not particularly feature-packed. But as a manual camera with good through-the-lens metering and simple controls, it's actually really nice to use. And it's nicely engineered once you get inside too. I often find bigger and heavier cameras easier to shoot handheld at slow shutter speeds, and this is definitely the case with the 500 DTL. This shot was taken at a 15th or maybe even an 1/8 of a second, albeit that I had my elbow hooked over the railings for a bit of extra support, but it's definitely easier to keep stable than a small light camera. Judging by the two Mamiya lenses that I've tried, their optics seem to be pretty good too, so I'm definitely a fan. Most importantly, the 500 DTL is another of those cameras that just makes me smile every time I use it, and now I've got round to shooting this video, I can put another film in it and have a bit more fun. I think that's probably about it for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.